Okay. So as Brendan said, my name's Andrew, and my talk today is going to be on measuring and reproducing urban soundscapes. And before I start, just a little bit of background on me and sort of how I came to be where I am. Um, Before starting my PhD at UCL, I was an acoustics consultant at Newson Brown in Los Angeles, which is, as Brendan said, where we met up. I've also been a soundscape, as far as I know, the world's first soundscape consultant and an acoustics consultant at Hoare Lea here in London. And I'm now a PhD student at UCL, where my thesis is titled Machine Learning and Regression Modeling of Dynamic Urban Soundscapes. So that sort of brings us to the first question of this, which is what is soundscape and why are we focused on it? So as I'm sure most of you all know, the decibel is sort of the most commonly used index for environmental acoustics and noise pollution. But the problem is that it's not really well correlated with human perception. And its applicability relating to some regulations for like noise control and noise pollution has been in pretty serious doubt. There have been some efforts to improve this situation, including things like allowing for adjusted level requirements for different kinds of noises. For instance, when we're dealing with wind farm noise, an increased lower limit is imposed for properties which are financially involved. So we acknowledge that there's some problems with strictly applying decibel to things like what sort of noise people will tolerate. But these sorts of efforts, sorry, and I should say one other example is, for instance, decibel level penalties for types of sounds, right? For impulsive sounds, we impose a penalty on, the perceived noise level. Um, but these are all still concentrating on noise control rather than on designing overall environments. And so moving away from this noise control focus involves treating sound as a resource as opposed to merely focusing on it as a nuisance. And so I particularly focus on implementing these sorts of things for smart city design, uh, which is sort of, moving forward a future of how we should design cities. And for that, we should focus on improving quality of life, which we know is heavily driven by perception as opposed to strictly to noise levels. And this sort of approach isn't some pie in the sky thing of trying to focus more on perception. It's entered into some legislation and policy in Europe. For instance, in 2002, the Environmental Noise Directive, which imposed this requirement to have 5 noise maps every 5 years, also laid out a requirement to establish methods to preserve quiet areas, right? And it was sort of loose on what actually is defined as a quiet area. But it sort of indicated this focus towards, restorative soundscapes, restorative environments. Um, and in fact, the Welsh government, which incidentally is where I did my undergraduate study in Cardiff, has specifically created a noise and soundscape action plan, trying to raise the perceived sound environment as a key component of the built environment, as they say, on an equal footing with things like housing, transportation, and economic development, which is very exciting to see. And then sort of more core to what I work on, Soundscape itself has been formalized by a recent ISO standard, series of recent ISO standards, and so we're going to get into a bit of that soon. So let's get strictly into what is a soundscape. I've said a couple of things about how it's related to perception and moving away from strictly noise levels. But it's technically defined as the acoustic environment as perceived or experienced and or understood by a person or people in context, which frankly is just a mouthful and not a very nice definition to work with. But the thing that it's really trying to get at is treating the sound perception as not just the sound level or the sound environment, but the sound environment plus all of the contextual factors that go into it, and focusing on the perceived outcome, right? So this is the sort of diagram that the ISO gives, trying to illustrate how this works. We have the sound sources that we're all sort of, that we can all imagine, which form the acoustic environment and interact with a person's context, either visual context or their personal factors and backgrounds, to create an auditory sensation and interpretation and result in perceptual outcomes. But this raises the question of, how do we measure perception? You know, I think pretty much all of us here are engineers of one way or another, and we want to know, how do we actually measure that? How do we talk about that? So the method that we use in Urban Soundscape comes from a study done in 2010, where they asked a panel of people a series of something like 120 adjectives to describe a series of sound environments that they were exposed to. And you can see examples of the adjectives that they were asked here, trying to describe how they were responding to the sound environment. And then they did what's called principal components analysis, which could basically collapse that 120 dimensions down into the primary core components. And we can see that certain adjectives group up together, in this space. Sort of the one that we're most interested in here in pleasantness, which is, we can see all these adjectives that group around the positive x-axis here are sort of pleasant adjectives. On the other side, we get annoying or unpleasant adjectives. But the really interesting part is that then this is orthogonal to eventfulness, and on the opposite side, the uneventfulness. So the concept here is that we can describe the perception of a sound environment in a two-dimensional space as a combination of the pleasantness and the eventfulness of a space, which also leads us to have various sort of combinations of those two. For instance, a soundscape which is pleasant and uneventful is calm, right? And then on the opposite side, if it's unpleasant and eventful, it would be chaotic. And this becomes a really useful tool, a really powerful tool for us to take this very multi-dimensional thing of the perception of sound and collapse it down into two primary components that can essentially be plotted together. And we can take this whole diagram here of hundreds of adjectives and collapse it down into these 8 what we sort of call perceptual attributes. So within our thinking on Urban Soundscape, we describe soundscapes in terms of these pleasant, vibrant, eventful, chaotic sorts of attributes of a soundscape. And any particular soundscape could be plotted on this two-dimensional plane. And as I say, this has been formalized now by the ISO standard. But again, this raises some questions for us. You know, we can talk about labeling something in this way, but then how do we put it into engineering practice, and how do we make use of it in engineering and design, right? So this is more specifically what my research and our team here at UCL gets into, which is called the Soundscape Indices Project. And we have a couple of key goals for this, which I'm going to be going into for the rest of the presentation. So the first is using Soundscape for the characterization of spaces. And so we want to more easily enable Soundscape characterization because current methods are survey methods. You go out and you ask people, how do you perceive this space, using this tool that we've just described. But with any survey-based method, it's difficult to assess the soundscape of many spaces across a city, right? It's just labor intensive. And so we wanted to create a method which makes that easier to do on larger scales. The second goal of the SSID project is to enable Soundscape for design of spaces, specifically to enable the prediction of the soundscape of a space. These survey methods that currently exist can only be applied post hoc, right? After a space exists, we go and ask people how they perceive it. But if you're thinking about, all right, how do I design, for instance, a calm space? You need a predictive method in order to say, this thing that I change will create a calm space. And it's necessary for determining the soundscape impact of any proposed design. So our Soundscape index, which is the SSID, has three main requirements. The first is that it should be based on objective or measurable factors, so that that it's something that you can measure, and more importantly to me, that you can predict, right? We can say this is what the sound level will be, and then this is how that feeds into our model to create this outcome soundscape. It should be generalizable to many different types of spaces, and it should be practical to implement without an excessive time or labor cost. Because if you're, I come at this from an acoustics consultant perspective. If I'm going to a client and saying, I'm going to use Soundscape to do your design, but it's going to cost you, 3 times as much as any other approach because we need to do a massive survey, no one's going to do that, right? So we need to be able to practically implement it. So towards that, and towards making sort of Soundscape more generally available, we designed what we think is a pretty good protocol for easily carrying out these sorts of surveys on a larger scale. And through that, we created a database from which my particular work is drawing to build a computational model of these sorts of things. For our Soundscape protocol, we had 2 design goals. The first was to be able to gather in situ soundscape assessments from the public, which can be further analyzed and utilized in designing the Soundscape index, as I've said, and also to simultaneously conduct recordings in order to reproduce that audiovisual environment in a lab setting for conducting controlled experiments, because there are certain things that you can't investigate in a real life setting. For instance, one of the core concepts of Soundscape is this sort of congruence between the sound that you hear and the visual setting in which you hear it. If those 2 things line up, then your perception of the soundscape is more likely to be much more pleasant than if those 2 things are in conflict with each other. Well, how do you manipulate that in a real world? You can't, but you can do it in a lab setting. You could change the visual and keep the audio the same. And that lets you sort of test that sort of thing. So to do this, we break it down into 2 stages. We have a recording stage where we go out and make audiovisual recordings with 360 degree video, spatial audio for ambisonic playback later on, and calibrated sound level measurements. Because again, I came at this as an acoustics consultant and said, I need things which conform with like standard accepted environmental acoustics methods so that they can be, back compared to previous methods. And because a lot of good work has gone into making those sorts of methods, so we should continue using them. And the second is a questionnaire stage where we conduct this survey that I've been describing and collect environmental data, sound level meter data, and particularly individual binaural recordings and photos for each group of respondents. And that's what goes into our full-scale database. So here we've got sort of a visual diagram, a timeline of our survey protocol. So starting from the left, we start a recording stage where we've got our video, our ambisonic recording, our sound level meter, and our environmental data like temperature, lighting levels, that sort of thing running. We do that for 15 minutes. And then we start our questionnaire stage. And we'll go into, I'll give a demonstration actually of how we carry that out in just a minute. This is just a photo showing how our equipment gets set up for carrying this out. As I said, one of the key parts of this was to make sure that this is sort of easy to carry out in multiple spaces. And actually, the first place that we ended up doing this survey was in Venice. We traveled to Venice and basically tested trying this out in a lot of different places there. And so we had to make sure that we could take all these things on a plane and work with it easily. And that's it. That's our full setup that we take on site as just a tripod with some of the equipment that I'll go more in depth on now. So on top of our tripod, we've got our 360-degree video, which also takes 360-degree photos during the actual questionnaire stage. We have an environmental monitor. In this case, I believe it's called a hobo, which takes just temperature, humidity, and light levels. And then in our fuzzy cat there, we've got a Sennheiser Ambio ambisonic microphone and I can't remember which brand of sound level meter we used at this point. But we've got just a standard calibrated sound level meter microphone in our windscreen there. Though the cables for all that then runs to a backpack, which has our binaural headset housed in it that we take out when we actually do the surveys. It's got our NTI sound level meter. We've got the Mix Pro 10. Sorry, Mix Pre 10. It's a typo. Which takes the 4 tracks from our ambisonic microphone for the recording. And then we also carry all of our tablets and batteries that we use for doing the actual questionnaire stage. So a final bit, which perhaps is less interesting for you guys, but was very important for us, is that our surveys is organized into multiple levels of factors which may influence perception. So we break all of these different factors up into things on an individual level, which is the survey the person fills out, but is also the binaural recording, the exact sound that person was exposed to, and the picture of the exact visual environment those people were exposed to. The session level, because our goal is to collect 100 responses at each location that we were carrying out our survey, which is good minimum, just 100 responses in order to characterize a location. We had to carry that out over multiple sessions, and that includes things like the temperature on that day that we were carrying it out. And then the location level, sort of these features of whatever urban location that you're trying to look at. That could be the visual openness, the architectural type, that sort of thing. And so we've got a labeling system that breaks all of that down within our database. And then finally, the actual questionnaire itself has a couple of different parts. The first of which is the basis of that circumplex model that I described before, which has our 8 separate adjectives that we care about. We then ask people about the dominance of different sound sources, and then just their rating of the overall soundscape and how appropriate it is. So now I'm just going to play a short video, which demonstrates carrying this out.
Initially, the researcher walks into the area in which they want to do the survey. The bounds of this area are loosely defined by the area in which the environmental features of the space are consistent, which we've termed the environmental unit. And where the equipment is precisely located for the recording stage is mainly determined by where you want the perspective of the VR recording to be. As you can see, we have all of the equipment mounted on a single tripod, with the meters and multi-channel recorder in the backpack, which makes it nice and easy to set up on site. So the cables just go down to the backpack, hooked up to the SLM and to the multi-channel recorder. Then the 360-degree camera is mounted on top of the tripod at approximately eye level, with the environmental meter tracking light levels, temperature, and air quality mounted on the side. It's important to make sure that the front of the camera lines up with the front end fire of the ambisonic microphone. Once all of that is done, the researcher goes down to check all of the settings on each of the pieces of equipment and then starts each of them off recording. Once everything is started, the researcher will then come back up and give a little clap to synchronize the audio and video, and then leave it running for 15 minutes. So once the VR recording is finished, our researchers are prepared to go ahead and start the questionnaire stage. Here they will restart the SLM and pull out the binaural headset and its recorder. Then once a potential group of respondents approaches, one of the researchers will stop them, explain what we're doing, what our questionnaire is, and that all of their data will be anonymous. Once they agree to participate, the researcher hands one of them a tablet with the electronic version of the questionnaire and the other the paper version on a clipboard. The second researcher then stands next to the respondents and takes a binaural recording. Typically, this is done for at least 30 seconds, and it's important for the researcher to keep their head still for the duration of the recording. So we now have a calibrated recording of precisely what the respondents were exposed to while filling out the questionnaire. Once this is finished, the researcher will note down the group ID for that recording, which will be matched up with the group ID assigned to the questionnaires. The researcher then takes a 360-degree photo, and once the respondents have finished filling out the questionnaire, they'll hand everything back to the researcher and be on their merry way. The researchers will then prepare to repeat the process with the next group of people.
So that's just a sort of, actually, it's a little instructional video that we send out to some of our partner groups to demonstrate exactly how we carry out this survey. And so far, we've surveyed 30 different sites, which are like these different urban public spaces in the UK, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, and China. We've covered a wide variety of acoustic environments and non-auditory factors. And we've got between those, I think actually we're now above 4,000 individual responses. And so once we've collected all this data, there's quite a few different ways that we can treat this data, analyze it, and use it for our research, and use it for that sort of reproduction that I mentioned earlier. So the first thing we can do is extract just a whole load of objective acoustic features, which gets me particularly excited. So from those binaural recordings that we have, these 30-second recordings with the binaural headset, we can obviously extract any LEQ dB-based features. But we can also, in our case, using the Artemis software from Head Acoustics, extract a load of psychoacoustic features. Something we're currently working on is also extracting the spectrogram and using that for training a deep learning model. And likewise, we can also do this with the sound level meter. So the sound level meter is left running for the entire session that we're working with, usually around 2 to 4 hours. So we have little snippets, little 30-second snippets of exactly what each individual person was exposed to. But then we also have the overall environment, acoustic environment that was present in the space during that session. But from all of those videos and photos that we took, we can also go ahead and do some visual analysis of the scene. And so we've got a couple of different ones that we have here. Some of these are machine learning derived of things like object presence analysis that you might see Google doing. And so we can identify like how many people are in the scene, the different transportation modes, whether they're cars or buses or trains, and then what different types of natural or man-made features are there. Is there a bench? Is there a tree? All that sort of stuff. Then we can do sort of more basic visual analysis of the photos, which is just calculating the percentage of the field of view, which remember we have a 360-degree camera. So we can take this as sort of representative of that location of how much sky is seen from that point in your environmental site. But because we also partnered with King's College London, and their facelift system, which is utilized for characterizing the visual beauty of certain scenes, which they developed to be applied to things like Google Street View data. They have some composite scores that combine all these sort of more raw features and give a score for the walkability, the green cover, the presence of landmarks, the openness and visual complexity of the visual scene. And so those visual scores can be combined with the acoustic scores to tell us how these sorts of things interact in order to predict people's perception of a particular environment. And so that's sort of the core of the work that I'm doing at SSID. But this is all about measuring and analyzing soundscapes, and the title of this is also about reproducing soundscapes. So how do we actually reproduce these for our research? This is a photo of our lab here at UCL, which has a 12 plus a subwoofer speaker first order ambisonic playback system. And you can see it's difficult to capture because it's a relatively small room, but you can see we've got a truss with a series of 12 speakers mounted on it in a sphere, which gives us that ambisonic playback. And we compare this with a virtual reality headset with the 360-degree video that we take, and you can fully reproduce the audio-visual soundscape within our lab. And for any of the architectural consultants we have out there, here's the sort of the architectural drawings of the design of the room, which is actually what I spent my first 3 months on my PhD doing. And you can see, yeah, we've got this truss with the 12 speakers in a sphere in its own dedicated, not quite cube. We did manage within our constraints to adjust the dimensions a little bit with an attached control room. And so that allows us to do this sort of virtual reality audio playback. But we have some current challenge with reproduction, the first of which is that COVID ruins everything. And due to the lockdowns that we've had over the entire past year here in London, we haven't been able to get any participants in to actually use this ambisonic playback system yet, which is a real shame. But what we're trying to do to address this is we're also conducting some additional online surveys based on our binaural recordings, where we can get thousands of participants involved in this sort of thing, all listening to the exact same audio, which gives us a whole new database to look at. And we do hope to be back in our ambisonic lab soon, doing some more of these studies. So we've got our whole database to mine right now, and we've got these online studies, and hopefully we'll have our lab. I should also say, as you can see the photo on the right here, we built this with some modular absorption. So we also use this for some testing of some of our other research in the group, which is about these, what's the best way to describe them? Modular absorber slash diffusers. Interesting stuff. And we test those in this room as well. So thank you all for your attention. And as I said, our protocol is detailed more in a recent paper that was published last year. And I've got a couple of sites that you can go to, including the podcast that I host, which is all about sound in cities and soundscapes. So thanks very much. And I guess
wonderful. Thank you,
you guys that are here. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Should we do any questions with you guys, or did you guys have any questions, or do we just leave it for the follow-up?
My main question is simply, I hope or comment, I hope the UK section is having an awesome meeting. Um, for those watching this recording later, we were interrupted if it seems to be a disjointed presentation just before the last few slides. COVID doesn't indeed ruin everything, and but it didn't get us today. We carried on. We kept calm and carried on. Anywho, yeah, I think we'll try to schedule something. We can edit this out, but let's what we didn't miss is our usual presentation. If somebody wants to pin the two of us, we should put it in two separate pictures though, because it needs to be edited together. But we appreciate it greatly. I'm going to pause here with a smile.
Thanks very much.
Until somebody takes a screen grab of the two of us. Tradition.
Fine, hold on.
All right.
I think I got it. Let me just double check.
Okay.